Putin News Now. The West must now take into account the prospect of a political collapse in Russia. Without Russian President Vladimir Putin, the world may face an even more exciting, but also more dangerous, future. As a result, the Western world now has much more at stake in the conflict in Ukraine. Russian history is replete with bloody revolutions and coups, and this past weekend's mutiny, in which mercenary chief Yevgeny Prigozhin openly mocked the Kremlin before abandoning his march on Moscow, brought that history back to the fore. Meanwhile, the White House and its foreign allies were trying to piece together what was going on, which highlighted the precarious nature of a war that had the potential to alter the face of Europe and the course of modern history. A civil war that seemed imminent was ultimately avoided, at least for the time being. It appeared that the strongman in the Kremlin would back down before a military showdown with Prigozhin and his Wagner group. Putin's accusation of Prigozhin of treason and subsequent agreement to a deal that apparently allowed him to flee to exile in Belarus within hours later punched the deepest holes in the Russian president's authority in a generation. Putin's political survival is now in grave danger due to the war he started to destroy Ukraine. The ramifications have now spread to the rest of the world. That's not a one-day anomaly. In an interview with CNN's Christiane Amanpour, former U.S. ambassador to Ukraine John Herbst compared Prigozhin to the man who peered through the curtain in The Wizard of Oz and saw that behind the mask of fear and terror there was a small, scared man. This scandal will forever stain Putin's reputation. For Ukraine, which seeks breakthroughs against Moscow's already demoralized and poorly led troops in its new counteroffensive, the schisms in Moscow and between the government and Prigozhin's Wagner group, the only Russian fighting force that has enjoyed much recent battlefield success, may now conjure an opening. The West, which has financed and armed the country's struggle for survival, would welcome such an outcome. Even though Putin has shown no signs of ending the war by withdrawing his troops from Ukraine, NATO leaders would welcome his departure. At one point, a civil war between a faltering autocrat, the Russian military, and rival militia chiefs seemed likely in a country with a large nuclear arsenal. Such turmoil and unrest within Russia would have far-reaching geopolitical repercussions. The West really doesn't support either side of the fighting that broke out within itself over the weekend. Here we have Prigozhin, whose men are wanted for alleged war crimes and brutal human rights abuses in Ukraine, Syria, and Africa, facing off against Putin, who has brought Europe back to the horrors of World War II with his invasion of a sovereign neighbor and flagrant disregard for international law. Prigozhin has admitted to meddling in American elections and has vowed to do so again, so he is clearly not a friend of the United States. Leaders in the West have said that this is an internal Russian affair because they don't want Putin to have any new ammunition to use in his claims that he is the victim of a Western plot to overthrow him and diminish Russia's status as a great power and a geopolitical player. According to CNN's Kevin Liptik, Biden called the heads of state in France, Britain, and Germany and urged them to keep the temperature down and let whatever was happening in Russia play out in order to avoid World War III. A new Cold War-style standoff with Russia is a major foreign policy challenge for Washington, but no one in the capital is placing bets on Putin's regime collapsing anytime soon. On CNN's State of the Union, retired General David Petraeus said, "I don't think we want a country that spans 11 time zones and includes republics in the Russian Federation of many different ethnic and sectarian groupings to come apart at the seams." Is Putin's downfall finally starting to take shape? Simply put, we have no idea. Were Prigozhin to have been successful, we would have been concerned that whoever took over would be even more autocratic. Petraeus, a former CIA director, wondered aloud whether a pragmatic leader who steps in and realizes what a catastrophic error this whole Ukraine endeavor has been and realizes that they need to somehow get a more rational approach to Europe and the West, might emerge. A victory for the Ukrainians in this war has long been seen as a potential existential threat to Putin's rule. However, theoretical speculation is one thing. If the West wants to save Ukraine, it will have to re-evaluate its delicate balancing act after this weekend. The Russian leader's shame may prompt him to press for an even more brutal push in a war that has already cruelly targeted civilians in Ukraine. Putin's position could become even more precarious if political strife in Russia further damages the morale of its troops and leads to battlefield losses. The Russian leader has been rattling his nuclear saber for months, and this will only add to concerns of a catastrophic escalation of the war. And if the war keeps getting worse for Russia, the West could be in for another headache if the events of the weekend were any indication of the future stability of the Putin regime. In a Monday press conference, Josep Borrell, the foreign policy chief for the European Union, said that political instability in a nuclear power like Russia is not a good thing, adding that the nuclear threat is something that has to be taken into account. The United States claims that Moscow's nuclear stance has not changed. The most effective opposition to Putin did not come from the democratic movement that he spent years crushing, despite months of heavy losses on the battlefield and economic pain at home caused by Western sanctions. It came from Prigozhin, whose faction is even more conservative and violent. Fears of a bloodbath in the streets of Moscow were exacerbated by the fact that Chechen leader Ramzan Kadyrov, another extreme and bloodthirsty warlord, offered to help Putin suppress the Wagner rebellion on Putin's behalf on Saturday. Moscow's politics are a bear pit populated by thuggish militia chiefs, intelligence chieftains, and oligarchs, making their behind-the-scenes machinations completely unpredictable. The unexpected events of the past few days have raised concerns that Russia's next leader will be even more unyielding and difficult for the West to deal with than Putin. The Internet Research Agency, a troll farm that Russia used to spread disinformation across social media in an effort to influence the 2016 presidential election, was one of Prigozhin's pet projects. Expert on Russia and Eastern Europe and Dean of USC's School of International Relations Robert English said, "We're all maybe excited to see that Putin's hold on power is shakier and the state is more fragile than we thought, but we should also think as much about what would happen next." Not a liberal like Alexei Navalny or these other liberal critics of Putin, but a populist from the right who appeals to the same anti-elite, anti-corrupt instincts but has brutal dictatorial tendencies of their own, is what English predicted would come to power in Russia. Washington is unsure if the turmoil has ended. Washington seems to think that the story is far from over despite the hastily announced ceasefire brokered by Belarusian President Alexander Lukashenko, which caused Prigozhin to halt his advance on Moscow. Secretary of State Antony Blinken said on CNN's State of the Union on Sunday, "It's too soon to tell exactly where this is going to go. This is probably a motion picture, I think." At the same time, Putin's credibility as a leader has taken a serious hit. His rule has always rested on his ability to appease the various factions that report to him. According to Blinken, the fact that a powerful figure within Russia had openly challenged Putin's authority was something very, very powerful. It adds cracks, he continued. Where those go, when they get there, is too soon to say, but it clearly raises new questions that Putin has to deal with. The United States and its allies have good reason to worry that a depleted Putin will resort to more extreme measures in order to reverse a war that threatens his hold on power. Vice President Joe Biden has been very firm on the need to prevent this conflict from becoming a direct confrontation between Russia and NATO. However, the fact that the conflict is now causing deep splits within Russia in a way that could compromise the integrity of its operations may be an argument for rapidly increasing Western assistance to Ukraine. As Russia's assault continues, NATO Secretary-General Jens Stoltenberg said on Monday that Western support for Ukraine is, even more important, to help it retake more land and strengthen its negotiating hand. Despite sending billions of dollars and advanced weapons to help Ukraine defend itself in the most sweeping transatlantic mobilization since the end of the Cold War, Putin's apparent vulnerability is likely to embolden those who argue that Biden has been too timid. Some argue that the West has provided Ukraine with just enough aid to keep it afloat, but not enough to force Putin's illegal annexation of Crimea and the rest of the country's armed forces out of the country. Former CIA officer and Texas Congressman Will Hurd, a Republican presidential candidate, said on Sunday that the United States and its allies were sending Putin a weak message by saying they were monitoring events in Russia. The corresponding alternative term is That, as Hurd put it, amounts to wringing your hands and doing nothing.